Hey guys, picture this. You've just woken up in a drafty castle chamber, your linen shift clinging to you like a damp shroud, and the nearest bath consists of a wooden tub half filled with tepid rainwater that's been languishing in the corner since the last chimney fire. Sounds delightful, right? Now imagine having to repeat that glamorous routine only once or twice a year. Welcome to the personal hygiene of Elizabeth I. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Elizabeth Tudor, the reigning queen of cleanliness, or lack thereof, ruled England from atop a throne of perfume bottles, scented gloves, and bed curtains stiff enough to deflect a catapulted apple. In Elizabeth's world, bathing was akin to summiting Everest in flip-flops, theoretically possible but overwhelmingly unpleasant and likely to end in hypothermia. Instead of soaking in a luxurious tub of foaming lavender-infused suds, the queen relied on dry baths, a vigorous rub-down with linen cloths dipped in vinegar or rosewater, followed by an elaborate powdering with orris root to convince her court, and herself, that she hadn't spent the night sharing body heat with 14 chambermaids and 24 family cats. If you think skipping showers for days is gross, imagine stretching that luxury indulgence to months on end, all in the name of preserving the fragile balance of your royal pH. Now, you might wonder how one manages lice when you're only bathing in scented fabric. Enter the queen's secret weapon, her hair routine. Elizabeth's glorious red locks were no accident of nature. They were a carefully curated artifice built on a foundation of lard, vinegar, and something called tincture of cantharides, a preparation so irritating that it literally drove lice to suicide by jumping ship. Yes, those tiny pests would rather plummet from her stiff wig than endure another moment of royal scalp treatment. This process left her hands slick with fat, her nose raw from the vinegar fumes, and her hair smelling like a medieval kitchen. But hey, at least she was officially lice-free. Personal grooming wasn't limited to Queen Liz's cabinets of curiosities. Her court was equally committed to the cause of masking human aromas. Gentlemen sported pomanders, little metal balls dangling from ribbons filled with herbs and spices like ambergris, cloves, and sometimes powdered dried cow dung. Why cow dung? Because, apparently, nothing says royal sophistication, quite like a hint of barnyard in your entourage. Ladies of the court would tuck pomander pouches into their bodices or wrists, creating a perfumed force field against the stench of unwashed bodies. In fact, etiquette dictated that guests arriving too close to one another risked a cloud of overpowering musk, sufficient to clear an entire banquet hall in 2 seconds flat. But the brightest jewel in this crown of aromatic warfare was the queen's very own eau de toilette, a blend concocted by her apothecaries that combined rosewater, musk, civet, and ambergris. One spritz was enough to announce your presence at 10 paces or to send your dinner guests scrambling for fresh air. This royal cologne was less about smelling nice and more about surviving another lengthy council meeting without fainting at the sight or smell of a fresh pile of chamber pot runoff. Speaking of chamber pots, Elizabeth's throne room was never far from one. Castle latrines in the 16th century were communal affairs, long benches with holes carved at intervals, perched above a cesspit that, let's be honest, saw more action than any royal bedchamber. The queen, naturally, did not sit shoulder to shoulder with her subjects. Her privy was a private room furnished with a wooden chair atop a large earthenware pot, but the concept remained the same. Waste disposal was a daily adventure. Waste was either collected and carted off, or, if you lived near the moat, sometimes unceremoniously tipped into the water below. Cleanliness standards would make a modern truck stop bathroom blush. Now, let's talk clothing, the ultimate extension of one's personal hygiene, or in this case, the direct opposite. Elizabeth's wardrobe was legend. Gowns so heavy with embroidery, they required 2 footmen to usher her into a room. Those sumptuous silks and velvets weren't laundered after every wear. No, they were aired out, brushed off, and doused in yet more rosewater to stave off the inevitable funk. Underneath, the queen wore layers of linen shifts and petticoats that, when removed, looked less like delicate undergarments and more like relics excavated from a medieval dig. A single layer might be changed daily if she felt particularly motivated, but the outer layers were relegated to seasonal airing, which meant they might see a real wash only when they threatened to collapse under the weight of accumulated grime. In the privacy of her bedchamber, Elizabeth employed the services of the water women, attendants whose sole duty was to supply and heat water for her dry baths. These water women would fill copper ewers from barrels in the courtyard, haul them up narrow spiral staircases, and ladle the lukewarm liquid into the queen's basin. The effort alone was enough to dissuade most people from wanting to bathe. Imagine hauling 50 pounds of water uphill, only to have your charge rub you down with a vinegar-soaked rag and declare herself squeaky clean. One of the darkest, most ironically comedic aspects of Tudor hygiene was the treatment of teeth. The queen's dentists, her tooth drawers, used a mixture of ground brick, goat hoof ashes, and sometimes crushed mouse brains, yes, literal rodent brains, to polish enamel and stave off decay. Without toothbrushes or proper floss, cavities were the norm. Elizabeth reportedly lost several teeth over her lifetime, replacing them with dentures made from human teeth pilfered from the gallows or donated by loyal subjects. Can you imagine the moral dilemma of giving a tooth to Her Majesty? "Your Highness, here's my cheek molar, hope it helps." To her credit, the Queen's dentures were elaborately crafted and sometimes gilded so she could blind her enemies with a royal grin, or at least with a mouthful of shine. And let's not forget the pest control tactics beyond lice. Fleas, bed bugs, and moths ran rampant. To combat these tiny tyrants, Elizabeth's ladies would scatter herbs like lavender, pennyroyal, and tansy throughout linens and wardrobes. One false move, and you'd inhale enough herb to hallucinate for days, or worse, to repel the pests half-heartedly and wind up with itchy bumps across your body. These botanical barometers of cleanliness made castle life smell like a medieval florist's shop, which, when combined with all the other odors, produced a truly unique fragrance profile. But the queen wasn't entirely oblivious to the revolting nature of these practices. Later in her reign, she took to having more frequent sitz baths, small private tubs that offered a modest level of immersion. Unfortunately, the water still wasn't replaced often, so each successive bath diluted the accumulated slime until it was little more than a brownish tincture of previous occupants' sweat and skin flakes. Modern spa treatments would have seemed like witchcraft to her. Warm steam rooms, scented candles, daily libation. For Elizabeth, the only steam she encountered was the haze rising from the castle kitchens, laden with the aroma of roasting venison and overcooked turnips. Despite all this, Elizabeth is also managed to project an image of impeccable purity and virtue, a masterclass in branding that would make any modern influencer green with envy. Her flawless pale complexion, achieved through layers of white lead-based makeup, hid years of unwashed reality beneath a porcelain veneer. A single application of her legendary queen's own face powder created an impression of ethereal cleanliness that no mere mortal could hope to match. Meanwhile, her red wig hid every sign of scalp irritation from vinegar and lard, creating a perfect halo of flame-colored locks that dazzled courtiers and invaders alike. And so, dear viewer, as you luxuriate in your daily shower, marvel at your soft exfoliated skin, and rinse off the day's stress with fragrant gel, spare a thought for Elizabeth. She endured a lifetime of vinegar baths, lice-killing concoctions, and perfumed deception, all to maintain the illusion of cleanliness in a world that would rather stink than scrub. Next time you grumble about time in the shower, remember Queen Liz, her scented rags, and her eyebrow-raising dental practices. Because if she could rule an empire with only a monthly bath and a drawer full of tinseled wigs, you can conquer your morning routine with soap and water, and maybe, just maybe, appreciate every drop of that precious, clean life. See you next time for the second installment of our journey into medieval grooming nightmares. Trust me, you won't want to miss the chapter on monastic dental care. After months of relying on scented linens to mask the stench of one another, Liz's courtiers began to develop an almost Pavlovian response to her perfumed aura. One whiff of civet and rosewater spelled impending doom for your nostrils, and for your social standing if you dared question its splendor. But behind the scenes, the Queen's obsession with fragrance was less about charm and more about self-preservation. England in the late 1500s was a petri dish for every contagion. Medieval medicine had decided to label God's will, and the only real defense against typhus, dysentery, and the plague was a liberal application of something that smelled worse than you. Elizabeth's personal physician, Dr. Barnaby Googe, recommended daily fumigations of her private chambers, an operation that involved burning bundles of rosemary, juniper, and sometimes brimstone. You can imagine the scene: Liz, perched on her gilded commode, fanning smoke round her ankles as her lady-in-waiting wafted a smoking brazier like it was the gospel truth. The resulting haze was so thick at times that servants navigated her apartments by following the faint outline of her petticoat. And yet, plague victims huddled just outside those same walls, their moans suppressed beneath the scent of burning rosemary. Talk about living on the edge of hygiene. In wartime, when the Spanish Armada threatened invasion, Elizabeth's hygiene rituals became a display of nationalistic bravado. She refused to appear before her troops until she'd endured a full morning's worth of austere ablutions, essentially a quick scrub with sour ale, chosen for its supposed antiseptic properties, followed by more orris root powder than a dozen unfortunate brides. As she emerged, resplendent in her white-stained gown and clutching pomanders on each wrist, soldiers claimed to glimpse the very embodiment of Britannia. Never mind that her feet, encased in embroidered satin slippers, were likely caked in weeks' worth of grime. Optics, as they say, trump reality. Meanwhile, the broader court found its own creative ways to cope. Ladies carried tiny ivory combs, but these were rarely used on actual hair. They served instead as symbolic tools wielded during forced conversation, or the endless chore of resting one's elbow on the table. Gentlemen, meanwhile, stalked the corridors, spraying themselves with vinegar doused in lavender, to which they'd add a further flourish of musk via leather pouches. In the absence of modern deodorant, it was a sort of medieval layering. Vinegar counteracted odor, rosa water served as mnemonic perfume, and musk ensured that if you still smelled bad, at least you were memorable. But all these perfumed distractions couldn't hide the grim truth. Everyone stank, and they knew it. Court jesters joked openly about the royal pong, and ribald songs spread about how no man could court Lady Penelope without first courting her petticoat for several hours. Even Elizabeth's closest confidants weren't immune. Cecil's daughters reportedly quarantined their father after a diplomatic mission to France because his leather boots reeked of Parisian manure. If you think cross-continental flights carry germs, try traversing Tudor roads in brocade and taffeta, while the countryside blooms with uncollected excrement and half-drowned carcasses. This cavalcade of foulness extended to food. The royal feasts, those legendary banquet spectacles, were also olfactory nightmares. Roasted swan, boar's head dripping in honey, and platters of eels swimming in their own viscous sauces. Without refrigerated storage, nor much of a concept of spoilage, chefs sometimes served meat so aged it could bite you back. To mitigate the risk of mass poisoning, servants placed bowls of vinegar and peppered water around the table, encouraging guests to dip their fingers before plunging into the main course. A handy excuse for sticky fingers, yes, but also a ruthless test of one's constitution. If you survived dinner and the court fiddler's shrill music, you were practically immortal. Once the feast concluded, guests retired to the long gallery, where they might catch a breeze, and catch bedbugs in the bargain. Castle walls, being stone, held onto moisture, creating the perfect breeding ground for creepy crawlies. Tapestries, meant to insulate, became insect hotels. If you were lucky, you might find your lodgings carpeted in dry rushes, which servants would scatter fresh each year to absorb moisture and odor, and to provide midnight cushioning for startled backsides. The ritual of turning the rushes was a communal event, featuring pitchforks, torches, and a collective prayer that the new layer wouldn't itself be festooned with last season's rot. Behind all this spectacle lay a darker truth. Hygiene was a status symbol. The poorer classes bathed even less frequently than the elite, if at all, and the rivers they used for washing doubled as the sewers for everything from cooking grease to human waste. If Elizabeth's dry bath regimen seems barbaric, spare a thought for those who subsisted on river water so polluted you could literally fish out a boot and stir your soup with it. The queen, at least, could afford the luxury of rose water and scented gloves. The peasantry made do with a weekly dunk in a pond strewn with reeds and riding boots. Yet, in the face of all this, the Tudor fascination with outward appearances persisted. Paint and powder were liberally applied to hide blemishes brought on by malnutrition, poor sanitation, and the occasional syphilitic outbreak. If a maid fainted from the stench during a council meeting, She was simply breathlessly fanned back to life and told to smile for the queen's portrait. After all, a good likeness enhanced the monarchy's mystique, even if every studio had to be rigged with charcoal braziers to combat the damp chill of those windowless halls. Beyond the castle gates, Elizabeth's hygiene legacy had unintended consequences. Scholars in London wrote treatises on the benefits of healthful airs, advising readers to sleep with windows wide open and keep their feet out of drafty shoes. Apothecaries hawked potions promising everything from purified humors to complete eradication of foul vapors. These remedies, often containing mercury, arsenic, or crushed beetles, were effectively medieval chemotherapy. If you survived, you might look paler and drier, but also worse off in the long run. Let us not neglect the matter of menstruation, a subject so taboo that most women relied on folded rags or scraps of linen, changed when convenient or available. Noble women might possess cloths perfumed with hyssop or soint, John's wort, said to keep infection at bay. For everyone else, it was a matter of endurance. Ladies were advised to retire to bower chambers during their courses, ostensibly for privacy, but also to prevent contact with the general populace, lest the sight of a bloodstain incite mass panic or accusations of witchcraft. All the while, the queen maintained an illusion of immaculate decorum. Despite my earlier mention of occasional sitz baths, those were more about ceremony than actual hygiene. A grand procession of ladies-in-waiting would carry the queen's bathing chair through corridors lined with perfumed tapers to the bathroom anteroom. There, sheets were draped over rails to construct a makeshift changing area, an early version of the VIP restroom, if you will. Once Elizabeth was settled, her bath lady would unscrew the spigot on the cistern, letting water trickle in until it reached precisely calf height. Then came the ritualized rinse. A cup full of water poured delicately over her knobbly ankles, ostensibly to wash away the day's dirt, but really to stage a spectacle of refreshment for foreign dignitaries. Speaking of foreigners, ambassadors were repeatedly scandalized by England's approach to personal care. Spanish envoys reportedly wept into their handkerchiefs upon first entering the Queen's outer courtyard, overcome by the mingled odors of livestock, cesspools, and unwashed humanity. Yet, they had to endure it. To criticize too harshly was to risk diplomatic insult. Some tried to counteract by deploying their own scent squads, perfume-bearing pages trailing behind them like living incense burners. But no imported vinegars or Parisian waters could compete with the raw potency of an English castle at midsummer. It's tempting to chalk all this up to ignorance, but hygiene practices were less about medical understanding and more about social theater. The fact that warm running water was considered dangerous, suspected of opening pores to invasive humors, meant that any genuine bath carried its own health warnings. Better to stay dry, stay protected, and trust in the purity of your own sweaty defenses. Elizabeth, presiding over her fragrant kingdom, embodied this paradox. A monarch who plastered her skin in lead paint to achieve a look of godly pallor, even as she shunned the very notion of immersion. By the end of her reign, whispers circulated that a simple handshake with her might transmit more than royal favor. Ladies who clasped her hand reported a lingering stickiness on their palms for hours afterward, no doubt the result of her regimented powder application. Yet no one dared tease the queen on this point. She had a knack for turning even the most embarrassing personal quirk into a statement of power. "I am what I am," she seemed to declare with every perfume spritz, "and you shall bow to it whether you like the smell or not." So, dear listener, as we progress into the third chapter of this aromatic odyssey, steel yourself for tales of monastic bathing rituals, Renaissance barber surgeons, and the extraordinary lengths to which ordinary folk went to stay alive in a world that prized smell over soap. If you thought Elizabeth's lard-laden hairstyles were the pinnacle of absurdity, just wait until you hear how monks sanitized their skull caps, or how plague doctors tried to smoke their way to safety. Until then, treasure your clean water, your unscented shampoo, and your deodorant sticks. For as we've seen, in the Tudor era, survival was as much about olfactory endurance as it was about ironclad swords and a good sense of humor. In the silent cloisters of a medieval abbey, the scent of sanctity was meant to reign supreme, but in reality, you'd need a winged saint to waft you in pure air. Monks prized ritual bathing as both a spiritual and practical necessity, yet their bathtub was often just a stone basin scraped clean with a piece of sandstone. filled once a month with lukewarm water reused from the washing of communion chalices. Picture Brother Elfric, fingernails caked with graveyard soil, stepping into that basin clad in nothing but a penitential loincloth, reciting psalms as Sister Agnes poured in her contribution of mildly perfumed spring water, if any could be spared, from the fish pond. After a single splash around the ankles, the ritual ended and the basin's contents were recycled for watering the herb garden. Thus did piety and penny pinching unite in a single medieval ménage à trois. Venturing beyond monastic walls, we encounter the half-celebrated, half-feared barber surgeon. These fellows offered hairstyling, tooth extractions, bloodletting, and leech applications, all under one peaked cap. Imagine strolling into a barber surgeon's shop expecting a trim, only to find 8 patients bound to chairs, limbs protruding, veins exposed like red gutters, your head perched in a wooden yoke, scalp lathered with ash and brine to cleanse your impurities, while a cleric-cum stylist whistled a jaunty hymn and whacked at your locks with shears so dull you'd fear splitting your skull rather than a mere hair. Once the haircut was done, the blade of his bloodletter was reused on the next patient without fire sterilization. Medieval entrepreneurs loved a single-use model, as long as it was one use per customer. Post-procedure cleaning involved a rag dunked in bucket water, and a prayer that the next person wouldn't catch your plague-ridden humors. If the barber surgeon was the Renaissance man of bodily mutilation, then the plague doctor was the Renaissance man of self-delusion. Clad in waxed leather robes, a beaked mask stuffed with dried flowers and herbs, and gloves so pointy they might as well have been built for jousting. These specialists believed inhaling fragrant juniper would counteract the miasma of disease. One beloved remedy was to carry a live chicken under your arm, to sniff the bird's breath as a prophylactic measure. Patients who survived a visit from such a practitioner often did so by virtue of natural immunity, rather than any benefit from the chicken-sniffing protocol. Instruments, when not dropped in a cesspit for overnight purging by cold, were wiped on the doctor's own sleeve. Because what's a little cross-contamination between colleagues? Communal baths offered in spa towns promised curative waters, yet entry requirements were strict. No open wounds, no syphilis, and absolutely no lice-ridden gentry. Those rules didn't stop people from sneaking in anyway, turning the shared pools into petri dishes for every skin fungus known to Christendom. Bath attendants, armed with brushes made from boar bristles, would scrub your back until your epidermis resembled confetti, rinse you off with buckets of cold well water, then slap you dry with coarse towels that had been hung out in the sun since the prior eclipse. Afterward, patrons were encouraged to roll in the nearby dust to absorb any lingering moisture, flesh dryers of the high medieval era, before dressing in garments that had been aired on churchyard crosses overnight. Meanwhile, laundry day for most Europeans was a spectacle of endurance and ingenuity. The wealthy vinegar water greens were drizzled over collars to bleach them a passing white, while common folk sank garments into rivers, stomping them underfoot like grapes in a vat. The stench of rotting mildew mingled with horse manure and fish guts so intensely that floating clothes sometimes refused to rise again, forever entombed in the river's dank embrace. Bleaching fields used sunlight and stale urine collected from public urinals, nitrogen-rich and undeniably effective at whitening fabrics. Small children were posted at latrine belts hung outside the city gates, clanging copper bowls to attract passers-by eager to relieve themselves into the communal uric stockpile. Hygiene, after all, was a team sport. On the subject of shoes, cobblers baked them in ovens infrequently, giving them a charred aroma that only slightly improved with age. Peasants' wooden clogs were infested with maggots, an unexpected exfoliant for the feet, while nobles' silk slippers never touched the earth, lest they risk contact with the vile streets. Instead, chambermaids would carry nobles from carriage to threshold, saving those precious souls from the city's filth. Returning indoors, the same chambermaids would sit there, massaging lavender-infused oil between the toes, lavish smell therapy that would last exactly until the next trip outside. Let us not overlook tavern hygiene. Inns provided straw-packed floors changed once per season, and communal drinking mugs rinsed, allegedly, with cold stream water. Mug washers, typically apprentices, used the same rinse water for every vessel until it resembled pond scum. Patrons whose mugs still smelled fishy were branded life-length residents and swigged from newly boiled tankards until the ale could take center stage. Indeed, ale was safer than water, and so people drank it at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, fortified by the fact that lingering yeast cultures could neutralize some pathogens, while rampant alcoholism dulled any odor sensitivities one might have, developed from living in the first place. In rural hamlets, privies were a pair of wooden planks with a hole, a simple seat of shame perched over a ditch. These were emptied once a fortnight by gong farmers, masked figures who shoveled out excrement into wheelbarrows under cover of night. Their masks, not plague doctor style, but basic cloth soaked in brimstone tincture to at least smell like hellfire rather than actual hell. Villagers feared gong farmers almost as much as they feared ghosts. After all, who else could navigate your darkest waste and return, mostly, unscathed? Some families attempted to DIY their latrines by digging cesspits which, when full, were sealed with timber and abandoned, sometimes just beneath the hearth of the next generation's home, causing new owners to unwittingly rent the greatest outhouse in history. Medicine itself often required its own unique hygiene theater. To treat a fever, leeches were applied to your temples, because who doesn't love the sensation of wriggling bloodsuckers in the hairline? Once engorged, the leeches were placed in a small wooden box and sold to the next patient at half price, assuming they hadn't summoned royal teeth. Meanwhile, concoctions of mercury and arsenic to purge your humors meant you might exit the physician's office more dead than diseased. Apothecaries measured doses using spoonfuls calibrated by weight and by the moon's phase, believing that a drop too many during a waning gibbous could open the floodgates of your bowels indefinitely. To rinse the bitter aftertaste, they offered sugary cordials scented with clove and cinnamon, taste masking before it was even a term. The urban elite experimented with more experimental hygiene, hiring air washers who stood outside cities waving tartan cloths to disperse miasmas on high wind days. During processions, these washers would accompany the mayor, trailing banners soaked in vinegar to ward off any passing pestilence. While the mayor delivered his speech, the air washers danced back and forth, swirling vinegar vapors like spectral fog machines, early special effects for public health theater. Finally, as night fell and bodies of water cooled, those who could afford even a whisper of comfort retreated to night chambers, plastered with aromatic herbs. Sprigs of juniper, rosemary, and thyme were woven into reed mats placed around the bed. In the center, a brazier burned sulfur mixed with dried rue, the sleeper's incense, meant to repel rats, bed bugs, and intruding evil spirits. If you still woke up itchy, sneezing, or gasping for breath, you simply accepted it as divine will, or booked an appointment with the nearest barber surgeon for an urgent consultation. Through all of these trials, monastic mop buckets, barber surgeon chairs, and plague doctor beaks, our ancestors demonstrated a singular talent, the will to survive amid filth so profound it could rewrite the definition of unsanitary. They believed in the power of fragrance, the doctrine of dry baths, and the sacrament of vinegar, and if they could maintain their grip on life, rule kingdoms, and build cathedrals while bathed in such tawdry practices, you can certainly endure your modern inconveniences. So next time your hot water runs cold or your shampoo bar runs out, remember you're living a luxury their worst nightmare would envy. Stay clean, stay smug, and savor every drop of running water you take for granted, because in Tudor and medieval times, even a sip of untainted water was a miracle worthy of a market square sermon. By the time the dust candles sputtered out and the torches guttered, you'd think the worst of Tudor hygiene horrors was behind you. But no. Our final chapter plunges into the sordid heart of Elizabethan grooming, the pharmacopoeia of poisons masquerading as beauty aids, the ritual depilation practices that doubled as torture, the dental debacles that made leeches look humane, and the desperate birth control concoctions brewed in apothecary cauldrons. Buckle up, this is where the real madness begins. First, let's powder those lead-white faces one last time. Queen Liz's signature pallor came not from porcelain, but from a deadly cosmetic, Venetian ceruse, a paste of white lead and vinegar. Applied liberally to every exposed patch of flesh, it created that ethereal alabaster glow, but it also drove women into an agonizing cycle of lead poisoning. The skin, eroded by the vinegar, absorbed the metal, causing pustules and hair loss. Yet the remedy for those symptoms was more ceruse, ensuring a vicious feedback loop of poison for beauty. Ladies mixed it with egg whites to make a mask, slapped it on at dawn, let it bake under a charcoal brazier until it cracked like a fine crackler, then flaked off the dead skin only to reapply. Think of it as medieval chemical peels, except your face could never fully heal before the next application. Hair removal was equally brutal. Fearful of bristly legs or unseemly armpit hair, noble women used paste made from quicklime and pigeon droppings, which chemically burned hair follicles. They'd mash the paste onto their limbs, wrap the area in cloth, and leave it for hours. When unwrapped, the hair, and sometimes the superficial layers of skin, came off in clumps, leaving red, raw welts that oozed a foul-smelling ichor until they scabbed. If you survived without infection, you might brag of your silken limbs. Otherwise, you'd be banished to the infirmary to garner the envy of plague-ridden convalescents. But let's not forget the hair itself. Elaborate wigs were status symbols, but the routines to maintain them were nothing short of clinical. Wigs were dusted with brimstone powder to kill lice and nits, then steeped in fumes of burned rosemary to mask the lingering stench of sweat and tallow. A full wig resetting took 3 days. Day 1 to wash with goat's milk soap, if you were lucky. Day 2 to rinse in vinegar solution. Day 3 to style with teased hair powder made from pulverized starch mixed with crushed flowers. If a lock broke off mid-styling, it was expertly grafted back in like a medieval hair transplant. All this labor for a coiffure that would collapse into a sweaty pancake by noon. Now, oral hygiene, or the illusion thereof, deserves a final lament. Dental care was the arena of tooth drawers who saw every cavity as an opportunity. Without anesthesia, they'd clamp a leather strap around your head, jerk your jaw open, then lever out a decayed molar with forceps so rusted they sometimes snapped off, leaving shards behind. After extraction, the socket was cauterized with hot metal rods to stop bleeding, and your gums wiped with burnt alum to staunch infection. If you lost multiple teeth, your new dentures, made of animal bone, human teeth, or carved ivory, were tied to remaining teeth with wire. The result, a portrait-ready smile that clicked like a well-oiled door hinge and emitted a metallic tang with every word. In the realm of hair and makeup, we mustn't omit the eyebrow wars. Full, dark brows were in vogue, so fair-skinned women darkened theirs with coal mixed with soot from burnt almonds. This soot sometimes contained arsenic traces, leading to slowly creeping paralysis of the eyelids. Should your eyelid droop, you'd be labeled Queen Liz's smoky emissary, a fate worse than the plague. Those who dared to pluck stray hairs risked infection from unsterilized tweezers, creating festering boils that were then drained with unwashed needles, torturous both in pain and aroma. Turning to the trunk of contraceptive curiosities, apothecaries mixed mercury, quicksilver, and crushed basil seeds into pessaries inserted before intercourse, believing the noxious fumes would kill sperm. Many women developed severe vaginal inflammation from these experiments, sometimes leading to sterility, the exact opposite of the intended effect. Other recipes called for potions of rue, pennyroyal, and willow bark infused in wine. Taken as a cordial, they induced uterine cramps so violent that women sometimes bled to death. In a time when bearing heirs was paramount, these methods were tantamount to Russian roulette with your womb. And what of menstrual management? Women wrapped crude cloths around their waists, changing them infrequently, so infrequently that their skirts accumulated stains and muted maroons, never washed for fear of fading the expensive fabrics. Noble women might commission linen rags perfumed with lavender to hide the odor of blood, but commoners resorted to duck feathers or moss stuffed into drawers. The resulting dampness and warmth created perfect incubators for fungal infections. Doctors recommended air baths, which involved lying nude in a cool breeze, hard to arrange in drafty castle chambers without risking frostbite. Let's not skip over surgical hygiene, or lack thereof. Sections, for instance, were almost always fatal. When a mother died during childbirth, surgeons sewed the baby to their corpse with linen thread before attempting to save it, reasoning that vessels would remain intact. Unsurprisingly, the infant frequently succumbed to infection within days. Surgeons also performed tree panning, drilling holes in skulls to relieve evil humors. Patients were strapped down, the drill pressed against their bare cranium, and turned by hand until skull fragments fell away. No antiseptic, no anesthesia, just a prayer that your brain wouldn't bulge through the hole once the pressure was released. Now imagine the stench of all these operations blending with the castle's ambient funk. To mask it, servants burned distillations of rosemary and thyme in censers, creating swirls of fragrant smoke that floated through corridors like spectral wisps. Guests emerging into the courtyard mist believed they'd inhaled medicinal vapors, when in reality, they were inhaling the remnants of half-decomposed entrails being carted to the moat. Finally, consider the daily ritual of linen care. Every article of clothing was a microcosm of filth, sweat, skin flakes, blood, and excrement. Laundresses used lye made from wood ash to scour linens, rubbing with mangle rollers powered by human or animal treadmills. The lye would strip fibers, turning soft linen into stiff board, but at least the grime was gone. Whites were blanched on grassy fields for weeks, turned daily with pitchforks to ensure even bleaching by the sun. When done, the linen smelled of damp grass and caustic ash, a small price to pay for cleanliness. After all this, you'd think a final flourish of perfume would seal your survival. Instead, Elizabeth's court took to wearing nosegays, bouquets of flowers and herbs bound by ribbon, so powerful they might assault your nostrils with mentholated rage. These nosegays were refreshed hourly. Failure to rehydrate petals led to dust that coated floors like confetti, triggering sneezing fits so explosive they rattled goblets on banquet tables. And yet, with all these grotesque rituals and lethal beauty aids, Elizabeth of Wye reigned in health until age 69, an impressive lifespan for the era. She navigated court intrigues, warded off assassination attempts, and led England into a golden age of exploration and culture, all while slathering herself in lead and turning a blind eye to lice. If she could master an empire on a diet of vinegar baths and arsenic cosmetics, you can conquer your daily grooming routine. Shower daily, brush your teeth, use conditioner, and don't pour lye on your underwear. So here's the takeaway. Modern hygiene, with its running water, antiseptic soaps, gentle waxes, and scientifically tested cosmetics, is nothing short of a miracle. Every time you rinse, lather, shave, or style, you're standing on the shoulders of medieval mad scientists whose inventions nearly killed them, and you. Remember their sacrifice the next time you cower at your shampoo's price tag or grumble over a lackluster conditioner, because in the grand tapestry of history, every bubble bath is a triumph, every clear complexion a victory over the odds, and every hygienic convenience a gentle rebuke to Elizabeth's powdered poison and pigeon drop paste. Stay bubbly, my friends, and may your lather always be free of lead. Imagine you're huddled in a cramped tent on a misty battlefield, the wind carrying whispers of cannon fire. And then suddenly, you catch it, a pungent, unmistakable aroma that hits you harder than grape shot. That, my friends, is the scent of Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Welcome to the olfactory battlefield. Napoleon Bonaparte was a man defined by precision, in tactics, in strategy, and curiously enough, in scent. He wasn't content with the common soldier's musk-soaked uniform or the aristocrat's suffocating cloud of musk and ambergris. No, the future emperor of the French approached personal fragrance like he did artillery deployment, carefully, ruthlessly, and with an eye toward domination. Morning in Camp Bonaparte was a ritual as exacting as positioning your artillery batteries at dawn. While soldiers scrubbed themselves in stagnant river water, Napoleon demanded a basin of heated water infused with a single drop of lavender oil. Too much, and the scent would overpower his officers. Too little, and his reputation for immaculate discipline would suffer. As his valet, Francois, shaved him with razors honed like sabers, he would whisper, "Sire, a dab of eau de cologne behind the ears." Napoleon would inhale the cool citrus top notes with a critical eye, just enough to mask the wet officer stink. We can't have our troops flinching at their commander's arrival. Beyond lavender and citrus, Napoleon's true signature was an exotic concoction imported from the Orient, a blend of amber, sandalwood, and a rare resin called labdanum. He insisted each vial be sealed in French crystal and stored in a chest lined with goose feathers to preserve its potency. When he strode into a war council, boots polished to a mirror shine, bicorn hat tilted at a rakish angle, he trailed a faint cloud of smoky sweetness, a scent so distinctive that generals claimed they could track his movements by fragrance alone. That smell, one aide confided, was my cue to stay silent and salute. But Napoleon's obsession with scent was about more than mere vanity. In an era before antiseptics, soldiers' camps were breeding grounds for disease. Typhus, dysentery, and the ever-present threat of plague lurked like hidden snipers. Napoleon believed that the right fragrance could ward off contagion, or at least bolster morale. He dispatched agents to scour French colonies for the finest distilled eucalyptus and peppermint oils, which he had diffused in the tents of his most vital units. The cool medicinal aroma cut through the rank humidity of camp life, giving his men the illusion of fresh mountain breezes even in the marshlands of Italy or the snows of Russia. Yet, for all his meticulous fragrance plans, Napoleon's daily schedule left him exposed to the realities of soldier life. Campaigns often stretched supplies thin, forcing him to reuse linen shifts for weeks. When his valet begged for fresh shirts, Napoleon snapped, "There are worse things than wearing yesterday's sweat, François. Focus on keeping the Russians at bay." The result? A heady, complex bouquet of peppermint-infused linen, campfire ash, and a lingering note of cavalry horse sweat. Officers who dared approach him without covering their noses risked fainting and being replaced by someone braver. Napoleon's lavaliers, his close circle of generals, had unofficial roles as scent scouts. Their orders: approach the emperor from downwind and report on any changes in his fragrance profile. If they detected sour notes, signaling overused cologne or an expiration of precious oils, they were to discreetly request fresh supplies. Failure to do so was considered a breach of protocol almost as grave as miscalculating a battle plan. When on the move, Napoleon commandeered fragrant distractions to cover the less pleasant aspects of military life. He had entire wagons dedicated solely to transporting cedarwood incense and bundles of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, and roses, so that each campsite could be ceremonially perfumed before his arrival. He believed that a sweet-smelling commander was a more authoritative one. Soldiers reported that hearing the crackle of burning rosemary branches was as much a sign that the emperor was near as the bugles announcing his approach. But extremes often invite the absurd. During the winter retreat from Moscow, when frostbite claimed more lives than cannonballs, Napoleon's obsession with fragrance reached its peak. He ordered his scouts to scour abandoned Russian churches for remnants of scented candles, tallow mixed with beeswax and aromatic resins. The makeshift torches they crafted emitted a sooty, cloying haze that mixed with the biting cold to create a sensory paradox, the comforting warmth of candle smoke and the relentless sting of winter simultaneously. Officers joked that you could both feel and smell the pain. On his return to Paris after exile on Elba, Napoleon's first stop was to refill his signature French crystal vials. He visited Grasse, France's perfume capital, insisting that only the purest essences would do for an emperor restored to power. Artisans labored day and night, distilling jasmine from sun-warmed petals and extracting neroli oil with surgical precision. When Napoleon finally inhaled the newly mixed batch, his expression was unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, he remarked, "Now I smell like victory." Yet, never one to shy from irony, nature had its own counterpoint. During the 100 Days, as Napoleon marched toward Waterloo, sudden summer rains turned fields to a mire of mud and manure. No amount of sandalwood or rosewater could completely mask the stench of damp earth and livestock. Napoleon's entourage adapted by carrying small pouches of quicklime, throwing them on the ground ahead of his carriage to absorb odors and enemy rifle smoke. It was a crude tactic, but it worked, at least until the lime clumped in his boots. Even in exile on St. Helena, Napoleon's fragrance mania persisted. The island's relentless heat made imported oils spoil faster than he could use them. He adapted by planting his own herbs, lemon balm, lavender, and mint. His small garden became his sanctuary. Each morning he would crush fresh leaves between his fingers, inhaling their volatile oils like sacred relics of home. The scent of crushed mint mingled with the Atlantic breeze as he contemplated his legacy. An emperor undone not by armies but by time and distance. Napoleon's olfactory legacy endured long after his death. His personal perfumer's journal was discovered tucked inside a secret drawer of his desk, detailing daily fragrance rations, preferred vendors, even notes on how each scent affected his battle readiness. Perfume houses across Europe scrambled to recreate Eau de Lego, marketing it to military officers and ambitious courtiers alike. Though the formulas have been lost to time, the legend of Napoleon's scent, a complex symphony of citrus, spice, herb, and the raw notes of camp life, remains as captivating as his meteoric rise. So, as you spritz your modern colognes, pause and imagine the lengths to which one man went to command the air itself. Napoleon smelled of victory and defeat, of battlefield strategy and desperate survival, and of an unyielding will to control every element of his empire, even its odors. In his world, scent was another weapon, another strategy, another way to assert dominance, and perhaps that is the most shocking truth of all, that the emperor who shook Europe to its core did so not just with cannons and cavalry, but with the invisible, unstoppable force of fragrance. As we follow Napoleon's journey deeper into the labyrinth of hygiene and scent, the myths become stranger, the truth more pungent, and the air decidedly heavier. While most men of his time considered a monthly bath an extravagant flirtation with pneumonia, Napoleon had his own ideas about cleanliness. He believed in bathing, frequently and fiercely, but not for the reasons you'd think. For Napoleon, a bath wasn't just hygiene. It was therapy, diplomacy, and divine communion rolled into one steaming porcelain tub. Each bath was prepared with near-religious care. The water had to be precisely warm, not scalding, not lukewarm, and perfumed with a bizarre mix of ingredients: chamomile, bergamot, rosemary, and bafflingly a few drops of vinegar. The vinegar, he claimed, cut the fatigue. What it probably cut was the last thread of olfactory mercy for anyone standing nearby. He would remain in the bath for hours, dictating letters, giving military orders, even entertaining guests. Visitors were often forced to sit on a rickety stool next to the tub, dodging wafts of herbal steam and eye contact with a naked emperor. But etiquette be damned. When Napoleon was in his tub, the empire didn't just march on, it soaked. However, these aromatic rituals were not without side effects. Prolonged immersion left Napoleon's skin as sensitive as an overripe peach. His valet once described how, after 3-hour stewing sessions, the emperor emerged pink, pruned, and furiously cold. To counteract the chill, Napoleon demanded to be rubbed down vigorously with linen towels soaked in brandy. Not applied. Soaked. The friction would generate heat, he claimed. The truth? It just left him smelling like a drunken apothecary. But perhaps the most infamous chapter in Napoleon's scent story begins not with a battle or a bath, but with a letter. A love letter, to be precise. One that read, in part, "I will be home in 3 days. Do not wash." Josephine, Napoleon's tempestuous, stylish, and allegedly odorous first wife, was more than just the Empress of France. She was the living embodiment of his nasal fantasies. Her natural scent, he claimed, was intoxicating. Napoleon believed that the raw, unfiltered musk of an unwashed lover was superior to any perfume, and so she complied, sometimes going weeks without bathing, much to the horror of her servants and the glee of her increasingly primal husband. It should be noted that Josephine was a woman of taste. She adored perfume, perhaps too much. She bathed in orange blossom water, doused her hair in cinnamon oil, and filled her closets with sachets of crushed jasmine and ambergris. At one point, the couple's quarters at Château de Malmaison reportedly reeked like a spice market during a thunderstorm. Guests coughed their way through salons. Ambassadors blinked back tears mid-negotiation. But Napoleon? He was enraptured. Still, for all his passionate beliefs, Napoleon had enemies, and they didn't hesitate to weaponize his love of scent. British satirists published cartoons of him surrounded by noxious clouds, accusing him of trying to gas Europe into submission. One illustration, titled "The Stinker of Saint Helena," portrayed him hunched in exile, sniffing a dirty sock labeled "Glory." Petty? Absolutely, but strangely accurate. And speaking of Saint Helena, the emperor's olfactory lifestyle suffered a catastrophic downgrade on that isolated volcanic rock. The supplies of fine oils and perfumes ran dry. The climate was cruel, damp, moldy, and permanently scented like overboiled cabbage. Still, Napoleon refused to go quietly into the odorless void. He adapted. He instructed his servants to make perfumes from local resources: wild herbs, ocean brine, and crushed fruits. One formula involved fermenting guava peels in a jar with rum for 2 weeks. The resulting substance was a pungent, sticky elixir that Napoleon wore daily on his neck and wrists. He called it essence de résistance. Everyone else called it, please, no. In desperation, he even tried using tobacco as cologne. His snuff habit, already infamous, took on new dimensions as he began rubbing it into his clothes to mask the stench of damp wool. This had the unfortunate side effect of staining every garment he owned a deep, mournful brown. Historians examining his uniforms have commented more than once that they smell like a misplaced bonfire. Even his enemies were intrigued by his scent habits. After his death, British officers inspecting his belongings found dozens of empty cologne flasks, bundles of lavender stalks tied with twine, and a scorched kettle used exclusively to boil orange rinds. It was said that when they opened his wardrobe, a wave of stale rose water and mold nearly knocked them flat. The Emperor, one officer wrote in his journal, smells of memory and mildew. But the final twist in Napoleon's fragrant saga is almost too bizarre to believe. In his will, the Emperor left behind not just instructions for his legacy, but also for his body's aroma. He requested that his heart be preserved in wine, his stomach in brandy, and his uniform washed in the waters of the Seine. When asked why, he replied, "So that when I am gone, France will still know my scent." Some say the instructions were ignored, others believe they were carried out with eerie precision. Whatever the truth, when Napoleon's body was exhumed decades later, those present claimed it still carried a faint perfume, like dried herbs left too long in a drawer. Was it legend? Was it chemistry? Or was it the stubborn will of a man who refused to let time, decay, or death rob him of his favorite weapon? To this day, perfumers in France and Italy occasionally claim they've recreated Napoleon's lost fragrance, bottling his essence under names like Imperium, L'Empereur, and the more dramatic Sang de France. Reviews are mixed. Some find the scents mysterious and heady, others say they smell like a flaming library mixed with regret. But the myth persists, bottled and shelved. And why wouldn't it? Napoleon understood something few of his time, or ours, truly grasp. Power is not just sight and sound, it's scent. It's the trail you leave in a hallway, the ghost in a lover's sheets, the unspoken force that enters a room 5 seconds before you do, and lingers 5 minutes after you're gone. In that sense, Napoleon never left us. He floats on the breeze, in the pages of history, in the bottom of ancient flasks and forgotten footlockers. The man may be dust, but the smell is eternal. Napoleon's sense of smell wasn't just personal, it was strategic. This man didn't just march into cities, he invaded their noses. And to do that effectively, he studied not only the perfumes of his own court, but the stench of others. Smell, to him, was political warfare. If scent was power, then he would wield it like a saber. Take his infamous march through Egypt in 1798. Most people remember it for the pyramids, the Rosetta Stone, and the military disaster that followed. But Napoleon? He remembered the smell. He documented it in dispatches. Cairo, he wrote, was a city of gold and garlic. The sweat of 1,000 donkeys mingled with incense from mosques and open-air spice markets struck him like a musket to the face. But instead of retreating, he adapted. He ordered his men to soak their uniforms in vinegar and citrus before entering the city, partly to ward off fleas, mostly to avoid smelling like sun-baked saddle leather. Napoleon himself adopted a local musk-based perfume laced with oud, jasmine, and something vaguely resembling burnt coffee. His officers nicknamed it Desert Thunder. He wore it with pride, but not everyone was thrilled by his scent experiments. Local dignitaries, invited to parley with the general, recoiled at the strange mix of French lavender and Arabian smoke. One imam reportedly compared his cologne to perfumed cannon fire. The smell was so foreign, so overwhelming, that some believed it was a deliberate tactic to dominate rooms before he even opened his mouth. Meanwhile, back in France, Napoleon's perfumer was having a breakdown. Jean-Marie Farina, the genius behind Napoleon's Eau de Cologne, was bombarded with increasingly erratic letters. "Send me something with cedar bark and honey," Napoleon demanded. Then a week later, "No, cancel that. I require my scent to evoke the feeling of victory on a foggy morning." By the end of the campaign, Farina was blending perfumes with notes like gunpowder on linen and sweat of triumph. He once confessed to a friend, "I have no idea what the Emperor wants. I think he's trying to bottle destiny." And in a way, he was. Napoleon believed his scent should change with the seasons, the mood, even the continent. His winter fragrance was sharp and resinous, meant to cut through the cold like a bayonet. His summer scent, crisp citrus laced with mint and crushed basil, designed to fool the nose into believing the battlefield was a pleasant orchard. And in moments of mourning or political uncertainty, he wore a subdued mixture of rosewater and myrrh, what he called his meditation blend. It wasn't just for show. He claimed each scent altered his state of mind. Peppermint kept him sharp. Neroli soothed his temper. Sandalwood reminded him of power, of temples and kings. And musk? Musk was war. He doused his gloves in it before battle. Soldiers would say that when they caught a whiff of Napoleon's gloves, their pulse quickened. It was a Pavlovian response to musk and mayhem. He even developed a strict olfactory code for his inner circle. Generals were issued perfumes that matched their battlefield temperament: bold citrus for Lannes, earthy tobacco for Murat, pine and smoke for Ney. Anyone who deviated risked ridicule, or worse, reassignment. When one unlucky colonel arrived at a war council reeking of vanilla, Napoleon stared him down and muttered, "Are you here to conquer Europe or seduce a pastry?" But perhaps the strangest part of this scented empire was Napoleon's bedchamber. At the Tuileries, his personal quarters were a laboratory of scent. The room was lined with scented wax panels infused with frankincense and rose. A small copper pot, always burning, released a slow stream of eucalyptus oil into the air. His bed sheets were washed not in water, but in milk and crushed violets. Every evening, his valet would mist the pillow with orange blossom water and slip a sachet of cardamom under the mattress. It wasn't romance, it was regimen. He claimed he slept better, surrounded by smells of control and order. And God help any servant who disrupted the scent balance. Once, during a stay in Vienna, a hotel maid replaced his usual pillow mist with lavender. The result? A full-blown diplomatic incident. Napoleon refused to sleep until the pillow was incinerated and the room refumigated with his approved formula. "If I am to dream of empire," he reportedly said, "let it be scented accordingly." But even emperors sweat, and when Napoleon did, he did it spectacularly. Despite his obsession with bathing, Napoleon had a famously pungent body odor. His sweat, like his ambition, was relentless. It clung to his uniform, soaked into his saddle, and wafted through war rooms like the ghost of military failure. His aides devised elaborate scent layering to contain the issue, applying perfume in 5 zones: neck, wrist, boots, gloves, and hair. Each zone had its own formula, designed to cancel out the others in case of emergency. Still, the stink persisted. In extreme cases, officers stuffed dried herbs into their nose holes like makeshift air filters. Bonaparte's own boots were lined with lemon peels, not for comfort, but as mobile deodorizers. And yet, no matter how much he sweated, the man refused to stop wearing wool. "Cotton," he declared, "is for the indecisive." And then came the Russian campaign, where scent became survival. In 1812, as his Grande Armée froze and starved across the Russian steppe, hygiene disintegrated into chaos. Soldiers stopped washing, horses died and were used as windbreaks. The stench of frostbitten limbs and unburied corpses hung over the march like a cursed fog. Napoleon, ever the olfactory tactician, tried to fight back. He ordered scented cloths distributed to his officers, scarves soaked in rose oil and pine resin. He insisted on nightly aromatic tents, small shelters heated with charcoal and burning herbs. But the wind was merciless. It carried the stink of decay across leagues. Even Napoleon admitted, "We are enveloped in death." Not just the sight of it. The smell. His boots, soaked with melted snow and blood, took on the odor of a slaughterhouse. His gloves, once infused with neroli, now reeked of mildew, and the once pristine vials of Farina's perfumes froze and shattered, spilling their contents into the dirt. One officer recorded in his journal, "The scent of empire has become the scent of collapse." Yet Napoleon marched on, sniffing, always sniffing, searching for the familiar sting of bergamot, the bite of peppermint, the safety of sandalwood. But all he found was ash and iron. By the time he limped back across the Niemen River, he wasn't just defeated, he was rank. His overcoat had to be burned, his horse's saddle scrubbed with lime and vinegar. The Emperor of Scent had become its prisoner, and still, when he entered Paris, crowds lined the streets, cheering the man they could smell before they could see. It wasn't perfume anymore. It was legend. It was the scent of glory baked in sweat, failure, and cedar. The scent of a man who tried to conquer the world, and nearly did. After his catastrophic Russian campaign and the smell of failure still clinging to his every thread, Napoleon knew he had to regain control, not of Europe, but of his own aroma. Returning to Paris, he didn't just rebuild his army, he rebuilt his scent identity. A lesser man might have wallowed in lavender-scented self-pity. Napoleon? He doubled down on the musk. He summoned Jean-Marie Farina back into service with a letter that simply read, "Prepare something immortal. No pressure." The perfumer, now an exhausted shell of his former self, returned to the palace with the creativity of a man who had stared too long into scented madness. What followed was the creation of Napoleon's most powerful fragrance yet, a concoction of bergamot, rosemary, myrtle, lemon, and thyme, an olfactory war cry. He called it victory, bottled. His enemies called it headache in a vial. Napoleon's second reign, his 100 days, was brief but undeniably fragrant. Before setting off to Waterloo, he personally inspected every uniform for freshness. He ordered barrels of citrus perfume shipped with the army. Soldiers were given scented cloths to wave before charging, the idea being that if they had to die, at least they'd do so in a cloud of thyme and bergamot. It didn't work. At Waterloo, the rain turned everything to mud, and Napoleon's precious perfumes were washed into the earth. His carriage reeked of damp velvet and mold. His soldiers, soaked and shivering, gave up trying to smell good and focused instead on not dying. When his boots finally sank ankle-deep in Flemish muck and the cannons fell silent, the only scent left was smoke, blood, and bitter disappointment. The empire collapsed, but the legend of his smell refused to die. Even in exile, Napoleon refused to let go of his olfactory rituals. On the island of Elba, he took daily vinegar baths and demanded fresh lemons crushed into his linen. Local staff were horrified. One maid reportedly said, "He smells like someone trying to hide a crime scene beneath an orchard." He had no army, no court, no throne, but by God, he had his cologne. After his final defeat and exile to St. Helena, Napoleon's obsession reached mythic proportions. Imagine a man, trapped on a windswept rock in the middle of the Atlantic, with nothing but time, memories, and 162 bottles of cologne. Yes, that's how many he brought. Not books, not letters. Cologne. He used them ritually. Morning, lemon and rosemary to simulate purpose. Afternoon, jasmine and neroli to battle the island gloom. Nighttime, a heavy blend of amber, musk, and melancholy. The guards joked he could be tracked by scent alone. "We know when he's angry," one wrote, "because he smells like pine and judgment." And yet, despite the tropical climate and the crushing weight of defeat, Napoleon insisted on wearing full uniform. Wool, boots, gloves, the works, infused with his signature scent. Every sweat-soaked fiber screamed, "I may be exiled, but I still rule my personal space." But the island air did not forgive. St. Helena was damp, musty, and unforgiving. Mildew crept into everything. His room smelled of aging mahogany and regret. One British officer described the interior of Napoleon's home as a confused blend of medicinal spirits, rotting wood, and something floral, possibly despair. Even his legendary colognes couldn't win. The sea air broke them down. Bottles went rancid, fragrances soured. Still, Napoleon refused to stop dousing himself, even when the scent curdled like old wine. He wasn't just preserving dignity, he was preserving identity. His scent was his last empire, and in death, that empire endured. When he finally died in 1821, autopsists noted that his body was unusually fragrant, not from decay, but from layers of oils and perfumes that had seeped into his very skin. His internal organs reportedly carried faint traces of neroli and rosemary. He didn't just wear cologne, he became it. And then came the posthumous scent wars. As the 19th century marched on, the legend of Napoleon's smell became a commercial goldmine. Perfumers across Europe began claiming they had Napoleon's secret formula. Bottles were sold with labels like L'Empereur, Elixir of Son, Helena, and laughably, Napoleon's victory musk. Most of them smelled like lemon soap and marketing. Then came the relic hunters. One British collector claimed to own Napoleon's actual perfumed gloves, which he kept in a glass case. Visitors reported the gloves still smelled faintly of lavender and decay. Others collected his used linens, empty vials, even the corks of his cologne bottles, selling them to fans who longed to sniff a piece of imperial glory. In 1840, when Napoleon's remains were returned to France in a state funeral fit for a god, mourners claimed the air around his tomb carried an aroma not of death, but of something holy, like myrrh, rose, and memory. Was it true? Probably not. But the myth endured. Napoleon didn't just change Europe, he changed the way it smelled. Today, we live in a world that forgets how bad history really stank. We imagine emperors as clean-shaven marble statues, forever dignified and vaguely lemon-scented. But the truth is muddier, sweatier, and far more pungent. Napoleon was no exception. He was the Emperor of France, yes, but also the Emperor of Fragrance, ruling an invisible kingdom with each drop of bergamot and musk. He fought wars, crowned himself, toppled dynasties, and through it all, he reeked, sometimes gloriously, sometimes grotesquely, but always intentionally. So the next time you spritz yourself with cologne before heading out, remember, you're not just freshening up. You're participating in a long, fragrant tradition of power, vanity, and survival. Napoleon did it before you, and probably better, and just maybe, with a little more time. Hey guys, have you ever wondered what kind of pillow talk an absolute monarch with unchecked power and a mild god complex might indulge in? What if I told you that behind the towering beards, golden scepters, and blood-soaked autocracy, the Romanovs were hiding some of the strangest, most unhinged intimacy habits in royal history? Welcome to a world where love letters were written in code, private pleasures were guarded like state secrets, and Tsars used their bedrooms like war rooms. Trust me, you're not ready for this dive into imperial madness. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Let's start with Ivan the Fur, a man better known as Ivan the Terrible. And if that nickname makes you think of charming candlelit dinners and whisper soft confessions, I regret to inform you that you are very, very wrong. Ivan's idea of romance was unique. Imagine a man who would marry for the 8th time and, on his honeymoon, casually have a few noblemen flayed alive for fun. The man wasn't seeking a soulmate. He was seeking total domination in all things, including the bedroom. His first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, was probably the only woman who managed to bring some calm into his brutal world. She was soft-spoken, clever, and managed to make him almost human. But when she died suddenly, possibly poisoned, Ivan didn't just grieve, he unraveled. He suspected everyone. He turned intimacy into interrogation. His subsequent wives were chosen more like suspects than lovers, often picked in elaborate palace competitions that made the bachelor look like a polite tea party. And his marriages didn't end well. One woman was sent to a convent for disobedience. Another may have been drowned in a bath. Others died mysteriously. If Ivan invited you to his bed, you didn't pack lingerie, you packed a will. By the time he reached his 8th wife, even the Orthodox Church was begging him to stop. They declared the new marriage invalid, and Ivan responded in the most Ivan way possible, by threatening to execute them all and then sulking in a bathhouse for a week. But Ivan wasn't alone in his spectacular dysfunction. Fast forward to Peter the Great, the 6 feet 8 inches human hurricane who loved dentistry, shipbuilding, and apparently terrifying his mistresses. Peter was obsessed with control over his empire, his friends, and yes, even his lovers. He married Eudoxia Lopokina, a traditional Orthodox noblewoman who thought her job was to be demure and pious. Peter, however, wanted a drinking buddy who could tolerate watching teeth being yanked out. Their marriage went south quickly. Eudoxia hated his Western reforms, hated his friends, and probably hated that Peter would regularly disappear into drunken orgies and return home covered in sawdust and vodka. Peter eventually tossed her into a convent, because of course he did, and replaced her with Marta Skavronskaya, a Latvian peasant turned lady turned empress, Catherine I. Now Catherine, unlike Eudoxia, understood the assignment. She drank, she laughed, she endured, but even she couldn't avoid Peter's need for bizarre demonstrations of power. When he suspected her of cheating, which she likely wasn't, he had her alleged lover tortured to death and then made Catherine watch as his severed head was displayed in a jar in their bedroom. You know, to keep the romance alive. But Peter wasn't all cruelty. He did have a strange tenderness for Catherine. He gave her lavish gifts, like diamonds, estates, and occasionally used medical tools. This man was a collector of curiosities, after all. One of his favorite bedroom items? A taxidermy arm, preserved with perfect veins, which he kept in a cabinet near their bed. The symbolism? Unclear, but Peter probably found it sexy in a look at how I can dissect the world kind of way. Then there was Empress Elizabeth, Peter's daughter, who turned the Tsar's bedroom into a theater of wigs, silk, and sheer scandal. Elizabeth loved costume balls, and not just in the ballroom sense. She hosted intimate masquerades, where nobles were encouraged to dress like shepherds, milkmaids, or mythological beings before retiring to heavily perfumed private rooms. She had an affair with a Ukrainian shepherd who was promoted to colonel in the army just for being decent in bed. Elizabeth never married, but she wasn't lonely. She had countless lovers whom she rotated with almost military precision. Her intimate tastes? Exotic, theatrical, and sometimes absurd. One ambassador wrote home that the empress once made a lover sing to her in Polish, a language he didn't know, while dancing in a bear costume. Romance, 18th century Russian style. But perhaps the most outrageous story of royal intimacy came from Elizabeth's successor, Catherine the Great. Now let's get something out of the way. No, she did not die in some bizarre accident involving a horse. That myth was cooked up by her enemies and possibly a drunken French pamphleteer. But don't let that distract you from the actual absurdities. Catherine, born as a minor German princess, married the disastrous Peter III, a man who preferred toy soldiers to women, and once allegedly threw himself on the floor to pretend to be a wounded soldier. In the middle of dinner, their marriage was a farce. Catherine once wrote in a letter that she wasn't sure Peter knew how intimacy worked at all. "It is possible," she wrote, "that we both misunderstood what marriage was supposed to involve." So, Catherine took matters into her own hands, and into her own bedroom. She had a long string of lovers, many of whom were younger, ambitious, and very well taken care of. She promoted them, gave them land. One lover, Grigory Orlov, helped her stage a coup and overthrow her husband. That's not just pillow talk. That's political foreplay. Catherine was efficient. She didn't just choose lovers for beauty. She wanted intellect, loyalty, and ideally, a nice set of shoulders. Her palace staff developed a subtle ritual. When a new favorite was selected, he'd be brought to her private chambers through a secret corridor, offered a glass of wine, and if he passed the test, given his own set of imperial pajamas. No, really, imperial pajamas. And yet, Catherine wasn't considered scandalous by her court. In fact, many admired her confidence. She was a ruler first and a woman second. But Europe? Oh, Europe clutched its pearls so hard they nearly shattered. They called her a nymphomaniac, a deviant, a sex-obsessed tyrant. But in reality, she was just a ruler who refused to pretend that her private desires didn't exist. Unlike her male predecessors, she didn't kill her lovers or exile them. She pensioned them off, gave them estates. It was like an HR-approved breakup. We're only scratching the powdered surface. This is just the beginning of the Romanov romantic disaster files. Up next, mad Tsars with spy networks in their bedrooms, Tsarinas whose diaries read like tabloid erotica, and more than one royal who tried to turn intimacy into statecraft. It gets darker, weirder, and somehow even stickier from here. Let's continue peeling back the velvet curtain of Russia's most dangerously intimate dynasty, because if you thought the Romanovs had exhausted their scandal supply in part 1, oh no, we're just reaching the candlelit boudoir of madness now. The strange intimacy habits of Russian czars didn't stop with wild masquerades and imperial pajamas. In fact, as the empire sprawled and the stakes got higher, so did the desperation to control, manipulate, and weaponize every inch of personal connection, including the bedroom. Enter Paul Vermers, the cursed son of Catherine the Great. Now, Paul was born from one of Catherine's liaisons, most likely with her lover Sergei Saltykov, although officially he was Peter III's child. Let's be honest, if you looked at Paul and Peter III side by side, you'd think one of them came from a bad batch of bread dough. Paul grew up resentful, unloved, and desperate to separate himself from the shadow of his mother. So, what did he do? He tried to reinvent Romanov intimacy by combining paranoia, strict military discipline, and yes, violently awkward affections. Paul's idea of marital devotion was terrifyingly intense. He married Maria Feodorovna, a German princess who quickly realized that her new husband was emotionally volcanic. He would swing between obsessive love and furious suspicion, often accusing her of plotting against him with her own shadow. One courtier said Paul's affection felt like being embraced by a storm cloud. He would write her passionate letters laced with conspiracy theories, force her to pray with him for hours, then accuse her of treason if she looked too tired. But it got worse. Paul was obsessed with chastity, not his own, of course, just everyone else's. He believed that unchecked sensuality was the root of all political instability. He once punished an officer's wife for wearing a dress that showed too much collarbone and forbade his own daughters from attending balls until they were over 25. His obsession with purity became national policy, and his reign turned into a moral inquisition where flirtation was political treason. The irony? Paul himself was surrounded by a rotating entourage of male and female companions whom he treated with suspicious intimacy. Some historians even speculate he had emotional or potentially more relationships with young officers he promoted rapidly, despite their complete lack of experience. These favorites were often seen emerging from his private chambers in the early mornings, fully uniformed but visibly disheveled. Paul's psychological unraveling culminated in a bedroom coup, literally. A group of nobles, tired of his erratic rule and volatile embraces, stormed his bedchamber one night and strangled him with a sash. Thus ended the brief reign of the Tsar who weaponized virtue and intimacy into a tool of fear. And then came Alexander I, the Golden Boy. Handsome, enigmatic, and known in court circles as the Sphinx. On paper, Alexander was a romantic ideal. He had soft eyes, quoted Rousseau, and walked like a man in constant mourning. He married Princess Louise of Baden, renamed Elizabeth Alexeyevna, and at first it seemed like a fairy tale. But reality, of course, had other plans. Alexander was a serial emotional ghoster. He loved being adored, but detested actual intimacy. With his wife, he oscillated between poetic confessions and total silence. She, in turn, responded by having an affair with a Polish officer, and possibly giving birth to a child that mysteriously disappeared. Rumors swirled that the baby was spirited away to avoid scandal. The court, always hungry for gossip, claimed Alexander didn't care. It was one less thing to pretend to love. Behind the scenes, Alexander took multiple mistresses, often intellectual women who were expected to engage in philosophical debate and be flawlessly submissive. One lover described their relationship as an endless discussion followed by uncomfortable silence. The man had a strange rule about not touching anyone unless absolutely necessary. His idea of romance was handing you a book about the apocalypse and staring into the middle distance. But Alexander's greatest romantic passion may have been God. After the Napoleonic Wars, he experienced a religious awakening so intense that he began to consider the possibility of giving up the throne and becoming a monk. Yes, a monk. His advisors were horrified, his wife was bewildered. His mistress cried, but not because of love. She'd just redecorated her palace and feared she'd lose the lease. Alexander died mysteriously in 1825, possibly faking his own death to live as a hermit named Fyodor Kuzmich. So, to recap, we had a Tsar who banned cleavage, one who was murdered in bed, and now one who may have ghosted an entire empire just to be alone with his Bible. But nothing could prepare Russia, or the world, for Nicholas I, the ultimate contradiction. A man who was obsessively loyal to his wife and yet ruled with a cruelty that could only come from someone deeply repressed. Nicholas married Alexandra Fyodorovna, another German princess, and unlike many Romanov unions, this one was built on actual affection. He wrote her letters almost daily, full of tender phrases and pious devotion. He even signed them, "Your loving Nikki." Behind closed doors, however, Nicholas's obsession with purity and emotional control morphed into something darker. He demanded complete loyalty, not just politically, but emotionally. He wanted to be the only person his wife could confide in, talk to, even think about. At one point, he forbade her from writing to her own family without his approval. Outside the palace, Nicholas cultivated an image of patriarchal perfection. He was tall, severe, with a glare that reportedly made generals cry. His idea of statecraft was control over borders, books, and bedrooms. Censorship laws under his reign didn't just target radical texts, they also prohibited novels that depicted passionate love or moral ambiguity. Because, of course, any story involving scandal might encourage people to have feelings. Nicholas's most curious act of romantic absurdity came when he tried to standardize courtship. He introduced a set of rules known as the moral instruction of the court, which dictated how young nobles could speak to each other, how long they could dance together, and how many times a man could compliment a woman's gloves before it became improper. Spoiler twice. After the third compliment, it was considered foreplay. Still, Nicholas wasn't without personal contradictions. Though he projected icy discipline, he was reportedly terrified of women who spoke their minds. He once demoted a duchess from a royal commission because she referred to herself as emotionally independent. His explanation? A woman cannot be free, she must be loved. Which sounds romantic, until you remember that in Nicholas's world, love meant absolute submission. Meanwhile, his wife, Alexandra, quietly suffered. She bore him 7 children and developed chronic health issues from the endless pregnancies and stress. She rarely left the palace, became addicted to sedatives, and reportedly believed she was being punished by God for not being grateful enough. Her diaries read like a slow-motion descent into despair, punctuated by entries like, "Nikki is kind, Nikki is stern, Nikki is God's gift, I must not complain, I must not think." And then came the whispers. Whispers of Nicholas visiting ballerinas backstage. Whispers of quiet tryst with court ladies too clever to leave letters. Whispers that the man who demanded total marital obedience was himself finding release in carefully hidden corners of the Winter Palace. No scandals ever erupted, because those who whispered too loudly were, unsurprisingly, sent to Siberia. As we close this chapter, it's clear that Romanov intimacy was never just about love. It was about power, about image, about maintaining a monarchy so obsessed with control that even its most private relationships were performances wrapped in lace and paranoia. But, we're not done yet, because in our next part we descend into the twilight of the dynasty, where sensuality meets spiritualism, political disaster, and yes, the Rasputin problem. Buckle up. The fall of the House of Romanov is one long, sticky fever dream of mystics, manipulation, and madness. You won't want to miss it. Let's slide further into the opulent abyss of Romanov madness, where incense smoke curls around chandeliers, diaries are soaked in tears and morphine, and the idea of a healthy intimacy, extinct. Welcome to the twilight court of Alexander III and Nicholas II, where repression, mysticism, and deeply bizarre emotional coping mechanisms become the new imperial love language. If you thought the Romanovs were weird before, now they're about to go full operatic. Alexander III, the Bear Tsar, was everything his father wasn't, towering, square-jawed, and seemingly carved out of pure Slavic granite. After witnessing the gruesome assassination of his father, Alexander II, who died in a rain of anarchist bombs, young Alexander decided that absolutely no one would ever get close enough to hurt him or his family again. That included the Russian people, his ministers, and frankly, emotional vulnerability of any kind. He married the Danish princess Dagmar, rechristened Maria Fyodorovna, and although their union was one of the few in Romanov history based on mutual respect and even affection, it was also draped in cold discipline. Alexander believed love should be silent, stoic, and functional. He built his relationship like he built his empire, with iron walls and thick beards. He banned flirtation at court. He hated public affection. He once said that kissing in portraits was an invitation to moral decay. The imperial couple's idea of romance was hunting together in total silence for 5 hours straight. When they danced, it was a rigid, militarized waltz that looked more like a duel with rhythm. When they sat together, they would sometimes not speak for days, and Maria would record in her journal things like, "His Excellency patted my hand. I am blessed." But don't mistake quiet for dull. Alexander's emotional world ran deep. It just ran underground like an old cursed well. He had severe anxiety about being poisoned and was known to lick his fingers after eating to test for numbness. He once locked himself in a cabin for 2 days because a fortune teller had predicted romantic betrayal. By all accounts, he never cheated on Maria, but he treated her dreams as suspicious. You smiled in your sleep last night. At whom? And then came Nicholas II, the final, most tragic and weirdest chapter in the Romanov love story. Nicholas was a boyish romantic stuck inside the crumbling machinery of an empire. He married Alexandra Fyodorovna, a shy, deeply religious German princess who quickly became emotionally fused to him like a second skin. Their love was genuine and possibly clinically unhealthy. Nicholas was smotheringly devoted. He called Alexandra Sonny and signed his letters, "Your very own Nikki." They would write each other letters every day, even when they were in the same building. Their love language, spiritual dependency, and compulsive co-regulation. If Alexandra had a headache, Nicholas canceled military meetings. If Nicholas looked sad, Alexandra assumed it was divine punishment for not praying hard enough. And when Alexandra fell apart emotionally, which she often did, Nicholas would respond not with professional help, but with cuddles and superstition. Enter the most famously greasy third wheel in Russian imperial history, Grigory Rasputin, the peasant mystic with the eyes of a goat and the moral compass of a crow. Rasputin wormed his way into the imperial couple's hearts by healing their hemophiliac son, Alexei. But what he really did was rewire their entire understanding of intimacy. Alexandra began to treat Rasputin like a wholly emotional partner. She confided in him, begged for advice, and saw his every word as a sacred omen. And Nicholas? He didn't just tolerate it, he encouraged it. Because anything that made Sonny happy was, in his view, a divine miracle. This led to scenes that wouldn't be out of place in a psychological horror film. Alexandra would kneel before Rasputin in her nightgown, asking for his blessings while Nicholas stood quietly by, watching. Rasputin began to advise on everything: politics, the children's diet, even military appointments, based on visions he had while bathing. Yes, bathing. And the rumors? Oh, they spread like vodka at a state funeral. That Rasputin was sleeping with the Tsarina, that he was hypnotizing the Tsar, that he had cursed the entire dynasty with his unwashed feet. Letters between Alexandra and Rasputin were intercepted, filled with phrases like, "Your touch brings peace to my soul," and "Come to me, dear friend, for my heart aches for your presence." In another context, maybe spiritual poetry. In the context of a dying empire, absolute political dynamite. Meanwhile, the court fell into absolute disrepair. Nicholas and Alexandra, locked in their mystic love cocoon, were oblivious to the social unrest boiling over. The people were starving. Revolution was fermenting like cabbage in a peasant's barrel. And the royal couple. They were praying, panicking, and calling Rasputin again because one of the children sneezed weird. Their version of intimacy became a palace of denial, decorated with icons, prayer books, and paranoia. Alexandra refused to let doctors touch Alexei unless Rasputin approved. Nicholas retreated into military headquarters to escape the chaos, leaving the empire to be unofficially co-ruled by his wife and her holy guru. Love, in their case, was not a salvation. It was a sedative laced with doom, and just when you think it can't get worse, it does. As the revolution approached, Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin was the only barrier between them and total destruction. When nobles finally assassinated him by poisoning, shooting, stabbing, and drowning, just to be sure, Alexandra went into spiritual collapse. She began hearing his voice in her sleep. Nicholas comforted her with the same tragic calm he used when signing execution orders. Their last months were spent under house arrest in Tobolsk, then Yekaterinburg. Still, they clung to each other, writing poetry, praying, and pretending none of this was their fault. They were executed together in July 1918, along with their 5 children, by Bolshevik soldiers. As they died, they held hands. So how did intimacy destroy a dynasty? Not through wild orgies or scandalous affairs, but through obsession, repression, and a refusal to accept reality. The Romanovs didn't lose power because they didn't love. They lost it because they loved like ghosts, haunting each other, incapable of breaking the spell. But hold on to your crowns, we're not done. In the next and final part, we'll dive into the postmortem, the myths, the madness, the rumors of survival, and what the Romanovs' strange legacy of intimacy means for how we understand power, sex, and control even today. Let's exhume the last buried secrets of the Romanovs, shall we? This is where our tale goes from decadently tragic to straight-up ghost story, because while the Romanovs may have died in a basement, their intimacy habits, myths, and dysfunctions continued to echo long after the gunshots faded. Welcome to Part 4, where obsession outlives its host, and the bizarre love lives of dead emperors still manage to rattle modern imaginations. After the execution in Yekaterinburg, the world didn't just mourn the royal family, it mythologized them. The Romanovs became martyrs, saints, symbols of lost grandeur, and for some truly wild fringe theorists, survivors. And at the core of this cult-like fascination, their deeply strange romantic entanglements. Let's begin with the one that haunted tabloids and spiritualists for decades, Anastasia. Thanks to the mangled and hidden remains, the youngest daughter's body wasn't definitively identified until 2007. In the meantime, the void was filled with countless imposters, most famously Anna Anderson, who convinced chunks of Europe that she was the Tsar's daughter, miraculously spared from execution. But Anna wasn't just peddling survival. She was peddling a fantasy of connection. The idea that someone from that blood-soaked night had escaped, carried their family's love, pain, and secrets into the modern world. It was intoxicating. Her story was devoured not because it was likely, but because it was emotionally satisfying. The Romanovs had died tragically, but maybe, just maybe, love found a way. Meanwhile, the personal diaries, letters, and surviving artifacts of Nicholas and Alexandra were being dissected like sacred relics. People weren't just curious about politics. They wanted to know how often the imperial couple kissed, what they whispered at night, what prayers they clutched during bombing raids. It was as if the entire planet had agreed. Yes, they were doomed. But tell us, were they still in love when they died? Spoiler, yes. But it wasn't healthy love. It was catastrophic codependence wrapped in incense and paranoia. The Orthodox Church canonized the family in 2000, not for their governance, obviously, but for their spiritual devotion. Their beatification basically turned their intimacy into a form of holy suffering. Paintings of the Romanovs now depict them glowing with serenity, clutching crosses like they're starring in a divine romance drama. Somehow, centuries of imperial madness got distilled into the final Instagram-filtered moment of true love, even in death. Let's rewind and zoom out. What did the Romanovs' intimacy really teach us? Firstly, power distorts affection. Being a czar meant never being told no, not even by your lover. Intimacy under absolute power turns into theater. You don't share your soul, you project an image. When a czar writes a love letter, it's not just personal, it's political. Every gesture becomes performance, and every partner, an audience member trapped in the front row. Secondly, fear makes people cling harder, not better. The Romanovs didn't become more stable under pressure. They became more superstitious, more dependent, and more delusional. They used intimacy as a shield against the real world, not as a bridge to it. It's like watching a couple rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic while insisting that love will float. Thirdly, and perhaps most disturbingly, history is obsessed with royal romance, no matter how grotesque. We will forgive war crimes faster than we'll forget a tearful love letter. People will ignore an empire's collapse if they can swoon over a photograph of a Tsarina holding her child. The public didn't want to remember that Nicholas's poor decisions got millions killed. They wanted to remember that he once gave his wife a bouquet of violets on her birthday. Even the scandals, Rasputin, the spiritual seances, the jealous tantrums, became part of the strange eroticism of the Romanovs. Their dysfunction was entertainment, their trauma poetry, their fall from grace Shakespearean. And every time someone lights a candle at a Romanov shrine or clutches a pendant with Anastasia's face on it, we're reminded that history doesn't care about reality. It cares about narrative. In short, the Romanovs didn't just rule Russia. They haunted it. Their strange, suffocating version of love seeped into the national identity like cold vodka into a cracked glass. And as Russia reeled through revolution, famine, Stalin, and everything after, some part of its psyche always looked backward, toward velvet curtains, whispering saints, and doomed lovers who prayed too hard and ruled too softly. And so we close the final curtain on this imperial soap opera. From Peter's lusty wooden dolls to Catherine's suspiciously friendly stallions, from Anna Ivanovna's ice palaces to Alexandra's spiritual breakdowns, we've seen it all. The Russian Tsars didn't just wear crowns. They wore delusion like perfume and used affection like a weapon. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived an 8,000-word deep dive into the most awkward, ironic, and unsettling romantic history you'll never hear in school. And maybe that's the final bitter twist. In the end, the Romanovs weren't assassinated by their people. They were assassinated by their own inability to be real with each other. Now, go take a shower. And maybe don't trust a mystic peasant with your love life, or your empire. Imagine waking up in a palace dripping with gold, surrounded by 200 servants, fountains, perfumed gardens, and you reek, not a little, not missed a shower reek. We're talking biblical funk, the kind that sends priests into fits and knocks birds out of the sky. Welcome to the daily aroma of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. A man so majestic, he ruled for 72 years, and so stubborn, he believed water could kill him. That's right, the man who built Versailles apparently thought a bath was deadlier than war. Louis XIV was born in 1638, a miracle child after 23 years of royal infertility, and almost immediately he was taught that he was chosen by God. Not metaphorically, literally, as in, "Hey Louis, you are the physical embodiment of France and the sun revolves around you." Humility? Not on the syllabus. But let's cut to the chase. What did His Most Christian Majesty smell like? According to sources close to the court, like the Duc de Saint-Simon and countless diplomats who had the misfortune of close encounters, the king had a presence. His feet were often infected, his breath could curdle milk, and his body, drenched in perfume, but beneath the orange blossom and musk, the unmistakable scent of old meat in a velvet bag. Why? Because he didn't bathe. Let's pause. Why would someone who lived in the world's most luxurious palace actively avoid water? The answer is equal parts pseudoscience, superstition, and royal entitlement. In 17th century France, water was considered suspicious. Medical authorities, who based their beliefs on ancient Greek humoral theory, claimed that water could open the pores and let in bad air, aka miasma, which they believed caused disease. Better to stay dry, sealed, and sweaty than risk being penetrated by invisible filth. The irony is gargantuan. Now, Louis did sometimes wash, in a way that would make modern dermatologists faint. He was occasionally rubbed down with alcohol, scented cloths, or vinegar. That's right, His Majesty's hygiene routine was a Caesar salad with a crown. And when he did bathe, on 1 or 2 documented occasions, it was a diplomatic incident. His bath would be lined with cloth so he wouldn't touch the water directly. Perfumes would be added in industrial quantities. Doctors stood by nervously, like he was being dunked in molten lava. And then it was over, and the court returned to sniffing their way through Versailles like nothing had happened. But don't think for a second that Louis was a dirty peasant in fancy shoes. No, this was a man who redefined fashion and etiquette. Every single act of his day was a performance. Waking up, called the lever, eating le grand couvert, walking in the garden. Each moment carefully choreographed, watched, and emulated by nobles who desperately wanted to be near the king, even if that meant gagging through his personal musk. And here's where it gets wild. He weaponized the stench. By refusing to bathe and masking it with dense perfume, he turned his odor into a signature. No one else in court dared reek like the king. No one else could afford perfume by the barrel. No one else could summon the authority to stink with dignity. Smell became social hierarchy. Now, let's not forget the surroundings. Versailles, while stunning in paintings, was a biohazard zone. Toilets? Optional. Most courtiers relieved themselves behind curtains or down stairwells. Chamber pots overflowed. Servants dumped waste out of windows. The gardens, those glorious, symmetrical marvels, were fertilized with so much human waste, visitors wrote home in horror. The air was thick with rose oil and rot, and yet this was the height of civilization. This was progress. This was the age of enlightenment, for fashion, art, architecture, but not your nose. Louis also suffered from a number of medical issues that made matters worse. As a young man, he contracted smallpox. Later, a fistula developed near his buttocks, a painful, festering abscess that required dozens of surgeries. He even allowed his personal surgeon, Felix de Tassi, to invent a special scalpel to treat it. Let that sink in. This man wouldn't take a bath, but he'd let someone carve into his royal flesh like it was turkey at a banquet. Priorities. Despite the smell, Louis was undeniably magnetic. He oozed charisma and controlled every detail of his court. And yes, women flocked to him, not just out of duty, but out of admiration. This guy was the Beyoncé of 17th century France, musk and all. He had a series of mistresses, some official, like Madame de Montespan, and some secret, like the quietly powerful Madame de Maintenon. Did they all endure the smell? Oh yes, but they were also pampered with jewels, titles, and influence, and they too mastered the art of perfume denial. Let's also remember, everyone stank. No one at Versailles was freshly showered or wearing deodorant. In that context, Louis wasn't so much unusual as he was standardized nobility with flair. It wasn't about being clean. It was about being powerful enough to not need to be clean. His clothes, on the other hand, were immaculate. He changed outfits multiple times a day. Every accessory, from his feathered hats to his red-heeled shoes, was pristine. But underneath, a body layered in talc, sweat, and centuries of bad medical advice. The irony hits hardest when you realize Louis invested massive resources into fountains, aqueducts, and decorative pools at Versailles. Water everywhere, except on his skin. It's as if he wanted to bathe in luxury, just not literally. So by the end of the 1600s, we're looking at a monarch who built the greatest palace in Europe, demanded ritualized flattery from everyone in his orbit, never fully cleaned his body, and still managed to convince people he was divine. How? Because cleanliness was never about hygiene. It was about symbolism. And Louis' unwashed flesh, cloaked in scent and gold, told the world, I am so powerful I don't need to explain myself. Even my sweat is regal. That's part 1. In part 2, we'll peel back the velvet curtain even more, into the diseases, surgeries, perfumes, and psychological trauma that kept Louis XIV in his court circling a golden toilet without ever quite falling in. Buckle up. The Sun King is just getting warmed up. Louis XIV may have feared water more than he feared war. But what truly haunted Versailles wasn't an enemy army, it was his own body. The second act of our fragrant royal tragedy begins not in the perfume-drenched halls of the palace, but in the king's own festering flesh. The year is 1686. Louis is 48 years old, and while portraits show him as a statuesque god-king, reality tells a smellier, more tragic tale. His health is rapidly deteriorating. He suffers from migraines, chronic constipation, rotting teeth, a swollen leg from a riding accident, and the infamous anal fistula, the wound that would become as legendary as his reign itself. Now, if you're not familiar with what a fistula is, count your blessings. But since you're here for historical horror, let's get anatomical. A fistula, in this case, was a painful, pus-leaking tunnel near the royal rear end. It made sitting, walking, riding, and existing in general excruciating. And remember, this is a man who held royal councils on foot for hours, in 5 layers of brocade and lace, all while pretending not to be in constant butt agony. Naturally, Louis didn't want to be cut open. Who would? But the fistula wasn't going anywhere, and the court doctors knew it. So did his enemies, both domestic and foreign. Diplomats gossiped about it, pamphlets mocked it, and in one of history's most disturbing PR campaigns, the king decided to turn his infected backside into a symbol of divine fortitude. He commissioned his personal surgeon, Felix de Tassi, to design a special curved scalpel, a grotesque little piece of metal that would slide perfectly into the royal wound. On November 18, 1686, Felix performed the surgery without anesthesia, because anesthesia hadn't been invented yet and chloroform was just a twinkle in the devil's eye. The court watched. Yes, watched. Like it was theater. The king groaned, clenched, and bled. The surgery was a success. Sort of. The fistula became a fashion trend. You read that right. Nobles who had no fistulas began pretending they did, just to have surgery and mimic the king. Aristocratic butt wounds became the Gucci bags of 1686. Nothing says loyalty like unnecessary anal surgery. This brings us back to bathing, or the lack thereof. In theory, water might have helped with oh, I don't know, open wounds. But instead, the king continued his tradition of being rubbed down with wine, perfume, and spirit of rosemary. He was marinated more than he was cleaned. Doctors insisted this was safer than bathing, lest the vapors of warm water disrupt his precious internal balance of bile and blood. Medical wisdom at the time was basically a dangerous mix of astrology, guesswork, and medieval vibes. Meanwhile, Versailles itself wasn't helping. The palace, though an architectural marvel, was essentially a beautifully decorated latrine. Let's talk toilets. There weren't any. Well, not in the modern sense. The palace had a few primitive garde-robes, closets with holes, but they were often broken, ignored, or simply too far away. Courtiers preferred to go where they stood, behind curtains, in fireplaces, or into decorative vases. Servants dumped human waste out of windows. The air was a fragrant mix of lavender water, rotting food, and feces. The king, to his credit, tried to enforce some hygiene regulations. He even issued edicts demanding better sanitation in the gardens. But when you're surrounded by 3,000 people who think chamber pots are optional, there's only so much you can do. His own bedroom, the center of royal life, wasn't exempt. It was cleaned regularly, but cleaning meant sweeping filth from one end to another, perfuming it and calling it divine. The king's bedclothes were changed often, and his shirts were soaked in cologne, but under all that silk, he still didn't touch water, and his body, increasingly riddled with infections and abscesses, became a battlefield of rot and ritual. Now, let's talk about teeth, or what was left of them. By middle age, Louis's mouth was a disaster zone. Dentistry in the 17th century was medieval cosplay. Tooth extractions were done with pliers, bleeding was considered therapeutic, and nobody used toothpaste. Louis's teeth decayed rapidly, leading to infections so severe that pus would drain from his upper jaw into his sinuses and then into his nose. He often couldn't speak clearly or chew. His meals were chopped into baby-sized portions and washed down with wine thickened by decades of barrel dust. His breath, by all accounts, could level armies, yet he still entertained foreign diplomats with smiles and charm, as though nothing was wrong. The illusion of divine perfection had to be maintained, even as his own body seemed to revolt against him. Let's not forget the perfumes. The 17th century was a golden age of scent manufacturing, especially in France, where Grasse became the perfume capital of Europe. Louis owned hundreds of fragrances: citrus-based colognes, ambergris, lavender oils, musk, rosewater, civet, a glandular secretion from a cat-like animal, and the ever-popular tincture of urine-soaked leather. Yes, really. The aristocracy believed that animal-based scents were richer and longer-lasting, so perfumes weren't just floral, they were feral. Louis layered scent upon scent daily until his skin was like a cake of misery and opulence. Visitors often wrote about the powerful fragrance that preceded him into a room, and lingered long after he left. It got to the point where his nose, constantly overwhelmed, began to lose its sensitivity. His perfumers had to keep making stronger and stronger blends to impress him. The result? Versailles smelled like a burning bouquet in a slaughterhouse, and yet he remained irresistible. The theater of monarchy triumphed over the reality of his body. His courtiers adored him, his mistresses still wanted him, the people still bowed, because Louis wasn't just a man, he was France. He embodied glory, wealth, and tradition. His scent wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. In public, he radiated splendor, but behind closed doors, the king was decaying. He suffered from gout, he had diabetes, he was prone to fainting spells. In one particularly grim moment, his leg swelled so badly that doctors debated amputation. He refused. After all, a divine monarch couldn't walk around with one leg. Better to die whole than live half. And still, no bath. The idea of water opening up his pores and letting in disease was too terrifying. Instead, he relied on linen shifts, frequent clothing changes, and ever stronger perfumes. His doctors assured him this was the pinnacle of modern science. So here we are, a ruler rotting from within, held together by silk, scent, and the sheer inertia of power. His court admired him, imitated him, and bathed even less than he did. Cleanliness became a class issue. To be truly noble, you had to stink in style. In part 3, we'll journey deeper into the rituals of Versailles, the madness of etiquette, and the surreal social rules that made the body odor a weapon, suffering a virtue, and bathing a peasant pastime. Stay with me. The Sun King's descent into fragrant oblivion is only just beginning. By the time Louis XIV entered the twilight of his reign, Versailles had evolved into a perfumed prison, a marvel of grandeur and agony, where not just cleanliness but logic itself had been outlawed by etiquette. Part 3 of this scented nightmare plunges us deeper into the absurdity of palace rituals, the horror of courtly hygiene, and the way odor, yes, literal odor, became a form of power, status, and psychological warfare. Let's begin with the lever, the king's morning wake-up ritual. Now, you might think the process of one man getting out of bed wouldn't require over 100 people in silken heels, but you would be wrong. The lever was a choreographed absurdity, a ceremony more sacred than a coronation. At the center of it all was the king, lying in his linen-soaked, cologne-crusted sheets, probably marinating in his own royal stench, as noblemen filed into his room in hierarchical waves. First came the most elite, the inner circle. They had the honor of witnessing the king open his eyes. Then came the physicians, the valets de chambre, and finally the lesser nobles and dignitaries. Each group had a specific time slot. No one could speak unless spoken to. Every gesture had meaning. Someone handed Louis his wig. Someone else offered him holy water. Another passed him his scented handkerchief, often soaked in orange blossom or rose water to cover the deeper rot of infected gums and unwashed flesh. He was cleaned with warm linen soaked in spirits, his body rubbed down with perfume-soaked cloth, and his shirt, new and freshly scented, was slipped over his thin, decaying torso. No bath. Still no bath, but lots of expensive olfactory misdirection. At this point, the king would sometimes receive visitors while half-dressed, ambassadors, courtiers, poets, all breathing in the same dense atmosphere of sweat, musk, wine, and wilting flowers. Versailles, despite its size, often reeked like the interior of an aristocratic coffin. Now let's talk about the court's etiquette of smell, because by now you've surely realized that at Versailles, stink was strategy. If you were too clean, too fresh, too citrusy, you were suspected of being lowborn. The nobility had long associated the peasantry with rivers, bathing, and labor. In contrast, true aristocrats didn't work. They didn't sweat, in theory, and they certainly didn't bathe like a common washerwoman. Their bodies were not tools, they were altars of God's favor. And you don't throw holy water on an altar, you perfume it. So, perfumes weren't just about masking odor, they were political. Each scent was a message. Musk for masculinity, rose water for delicacy, ambergris for mystery, civet for power, and tincture of myrrh, to confuse people into thinking you had access to biblical secrets. It wasn't unusual for a nobleman to wear 10 different scents layered on top of each other. The goal was to outstink your rivals in sophistication, not hygiene. Ladies carried perfumed gloves, sachets, handkerchiefs, even scented fans. Some even had little hollowed-out lockets filled with balsamic vinegar and lavender oil, which they would subtly sniff during audience sessions just to survive the fog of human decay. But let's not forget that the women of Versailles were no cleaner than the men. In fact, women's hygiene often involved slathering lead-based makeup onto already unwashed skin, powdering hair thick with grease, and dressing wounds with herbs rather than soap. Beauty and death walked hand in hand, wearing matching pearls and smiling with blackened teeth. Now, speaking of hair, wigs. Wigs were everywhere. Louis XIV's own glorious lion-like mane was one of his most recognizable features, and also one of the great lies of his reign. His natural hair began falling out early, possibly due to illness or stress. In response, he adopted elaborate wigs not just as fashion, but as statecraft. These wigs, often weighing several pounds, were powdered, perfumed, and maintained by wig doctors, a real job title in Versailles. These unfortunate men were tasked with detangling, deodorizing, and delousing these sculptural atrocities. How did they deodorize them, you ask? By dousing them in powder made from ground starch, orris root, and sometimes even crumbled lavender petals mixed with calcium carbonate and crushed bones. Not unlike seasoning a corpse. Wigs, of course, were rarely cleaned. Why bother? When lice became unbearable, you simply burned the wig and commissioned a new one. Court records show Louis owned over 1,000 wigs during his lifetime. That's enough to cover an entire field of aristocratic heads, all equally unwashed, all equally glorious. But beyond wigs and powder, Versailles' most pungent secret was its plumbing, or lack thereof. Despite housing thousands of courtiers and staff, the palace had no reliable indoor plumbing. The so-called toilets were wooden boxes with holes, often placed near staircases or behind tapestries. Chamber pots were everywhere, and emptying them was the daily hell of the lowest-ranked servants. You'd think that with all this wealth someone would have invented a better waste system. But no. Versailles was designed for performance, not practicality. The gardens had more irrigation than the bathrooms, and so human waste became part of the architecture, flowing under floorboards, dripping down stone walls, and lurking just behind velvet drapes. It became so bad that foreign dignitaries regularly complained about the smell. One German ambassador, upon arriving at Versailles, noted that the palace glittered like gold and smelled like death. Another famously fainted mid-conversation during the king's reception, reportedly after catching a whiff of something that clawed at the soul. But Louis remained unmoved. He still refused to bathe, still believed that water could kill, and so his servants continued their ritual of washing him with wine and perfuming him with oils. His body became a terrain of crusted wounds, old colognes and ceremonial linens. And yet, amidst all this rot and theater, something strange happened. People adored him. He became a myth, a sun king, an eternal flame. His divine stench was transmuted into sanctity, his bodily decay into political mystery. Even his medical crises became national spectacles. There was no room for reality in Versailles, only illusion. In our final part, we'll descend into the last days of Louis XIV. His failing body, his rotting leg, and the moment his scent finally failed to hide the truth. It's a grand finale of death, denial, and fragrant delusion. Stick around, because the king may never have bathed, but he couldn't avoid the end. And now, the end. The final act in the tragic comedy of Louis XIV, the man who ruled for 72 years, crowned himself as the living sun, and somehow managed to never once truly wash off the dirt of mortality. In this closing chapter, we peel back the perfumed veil of Versailles one last time to witness the decomposition of power, masked with roses but soaked in rot. Because no amount of cologne can hide death forever, not even if you're Louis the Magnificent. By the early 1700s, Louis XIV was old, sick, and still stubbornly unbathed. His physicians, who were less scientists and more glorified horoscope readers in powdered wigs, continued to avoid water like it was the plague. Though, ironically, actual plague might have been preferable to the atmosphere of Versailles. Instead of hygiene, they prescribed enemas, bleeding, and yes, more perfume. It's estimated that during his final decade, the king received more than 2,000 enemas. That's right. While the rest of Europe was discovering Newton and calculus, France was exploring the inner mysteries of the royal colon. He had custom-designed enema equipment made of gold, ivory, and velvet, because if you're going to flush your intestines daily, you might as well do it in style. But all the lavender and Provence couldn't hide what was coming. The king's body began to collapse under its own grandeur. A mysterious sore appeared on his leg, a simple wound it seemed, perhaps a scratch or an ulcer. But untreated, uncleaned, and kept wrapped in layers of ornate cloth and perfume-soaked bandages, it quickly became infected. Gangrene set in, and Versailles, already known for its floral-masked filth, now smelled unmistakably like death. As the wound worsened, the doctors insisted on continuing their ritual rub-downs with spirits and scented oils. Actual washing? Still off the table. Instead, they poured cologne directly onto the rotting flesh, which only intensified the stench. Perfume in those days wasn't delicate. It was aggressive, made from animal glands and fermented flowers, mixed with alcohol and hope. The result was an olfactory assault that mingled with the necrosis until even the king himself could barely stand it. Court etiquette, however, demanded denial. No one mentioned the smell. No one winced. No one dared suggest that maybe, just maybe, the king's refusal to bathe was killing him. Instead, they continued the lever, the rituals, the daily processions around his decaying body. Courtiers held perfumed gloves to their faces or casually fainted during meetings. It became something of a dance. everyone pretending the sun still shone brightly, even as it sputtered in a cloud of musk and rot. In his final days, Louis became increasingly delirious. His leg was blackened, the tissue consumed. Maggots reportedly made an appearance. Still, the royal physicians insisted that the proper application of musk, ambergris, and divine will would be enough to carry him through. When the pain became unbearable, they finally began to cut away sections of dead flesh, without anesthesia, of course. The screams echoed down the marble halls, but court musicians were ordered to play louder. Versailles would not be undone by reality, not yet. Louis himself, to his credit, accepted death with the same theatrical flair he brought to life. He gathered his family, issued final instructions, and insisted on continuing the daily rituals. Even from his deathbed, he wore perfume. Even in agony, he refused to bathe. And when he died, on September 1st, 1715, his body was so far gone that embalmers struggled to prepare it. The funeral was grand, naturally. The king was buried in Saint-Denis among his ancestors, with layers of flowers and spices to mask the decay. But even then, the truth couldn't be denied. Legend has it that the body began to smell so badly during transport that candles were required to be lit along the entire route, not for reverence, but for survival. And so the Sun King set, not in glory, but in stench. But his legacy, oh, it lingered. For decades afterward, Versailles retained the habits he had immortalized. Perfume remained king, water remained enemy. It wasn't until the late 18th century, well into the reign of Louis XVI, that real bathing started to creep back into the lives of the elite. And by then, it was too late to save the monarchy. The guillotine doesn't care how good you smell. So, what do we take from this? That royalty is just scented decay? That power can be held together with wigs and cologne, but still crumble under the weight of a simple wound? Or maybe just that no matter how high you rise, you'll still stink if you don't wash? Louis XIV may have dazzled Europe with Versailles and divine right, but in the end, he was a man rotting in his own bed, surrounded by lies and lavender. His smell, once a symbol of majesty, became the scent of denial, delusion, and the ultimate price of believing your own myth. And that, dear viewer, is why Louis XIV never bathed. Thanks for surviving this fragrant descent into historical horror. If you're still here, you deserve a scented candle and a long shower. Maybe light one now. Let the ghost of Louis remind you, cleanliness is not just next to godliness. Sometimes it's just common sense.